possible. Neil Butcher is the director at Neil Butcher and Associates, and he's based at South Africa. And he has more than 2 decades of experience in the space, which we are going to reflect on in a while. And I met him close to 10 years ago, first time in the World Bank Institute conference. And since then, we have been in touch on a professional level in multiple engagement. And so we found very exciting to be partnered with Neil Butcher Associate on any assignment. So one of the very successful entity deliver on time, all the time, in a very qualitative way. So therefore, we requested practically Neil to write this blog for our alumni and also beyond alumni to get some realistic challenges and also some success stories, and what are those things really works with the large-scale government system, and what are those systems we need to be very careful of while implementing ICT in education initiatives, looking at the different challenges. So I'm sure most of you would have read his blog, and which is really very frankly connecting and bringing out all those challenges. And this is an opportunity for Neil himself to present, and you can listen to him, and you can interact with him in person. Practically, you can see him through this Zoom webinar session. So with that brief, I will now hand it over to Neil, and Neil, over to you.
Thank you very much, Senthil. And I hope everyone can hear me well, and that I've also shared my slides correctly. Senthil, if you can just alert me on the chat feed if the slides go missing at any point, or if my audio starts to break up for any reason.
Sure.
I'd be grateful for that.
Sure.
As Senthil has mentioned, I've had the pleasure or misfortune, depending on your perspective, of having worked in the ICT and education space for over 25 years. And assembling this blog gave me an opportunity to go back into various of the documents that I've prepared over the years, both looking specifically at individual initiatives in which I've been involved around the continent, but also in terms of looking at various of the research exercises that we've done, where we've pulled together findings from various research reports and evaluation reports from around the continent, and sometimes beyond as well. And I've always felt intuitively that it's a little depressing to reflect on just how often people repeat the same mistakes. And I had that experience recently, in fact, again, because we have been engaging in Senegal in the evaluation of the Sankore project as part of a long-term impact evaluation that we've engaged in over 3 years. And in that particular exercise, which involves the distribution of laptop devices to schools in the country, we were seeing, again, a very similar pattern of experiences of things that I had come across, for example, here in Gauteng province in South Africa, where we've had the Gauteng online initiative, repeated 5 or 6 times, making the same mistakes over and over again, and so on. But as I went through all the research, it really helped me to see that all the common mistakes that I think people keep making, they actually do keep making. And I found that a little bit depressing, I'm afraid. So just in summary, I think these are some of the key things that we all know about, and I suspect you've all read about many times before. I think the most obvious one is when people develop very ambitious e-learning or ICT and education policies, but there's no accompanying allocation of financial resources in the education budget to implement those policies. As a consequence of that, the second key mistake that people tend to make is then to become very reliant on donor funding, or else special purpose funding that's allocated maybe as a prime ministerial initiative, but that typically runs out quite quickly and then creates sustainability problems. We've very often also seen, and sadly this remains the reality, that very often people design elaborate ICT and education initiatives with quite sophisticated educational goals, but in fact the infrastructure in the country is simply not capable of supporting those goals. The most obvious example of that is when technology is put into classrooms on the expectation that students will be able to interact online. And then we discover that the extent of the connectivity in schools, particularly in rural areas, is just not enough to come close to sustaining the kind of connectivity that's required for the interventions that have been designed. Of course, then also lack of capacity is a major problem. We know about teachers, and very often there's a lot of effort that goes into training teachers on ICT and pedagogy skills. We've been working with Jesse and others on the design of programs that support that. But I think the other key one that is less talked about, in my opinion, is actually looking at the capacity of people who have to run the initiatives within ministries. I've just started doing work for the World Bank, looking at education management information systems in various countries like Kenya, Burundi, Somalia, and Ethiopia. And I'm struck again by just how limited the capacity is of ministry officials who are very well intentioned and really want to do the best, but who simply have not been trained or prepared well enough to run the kind of initiative that they're being asked to run. In those EMIS initiatives, we've got people who are responsible for very large-scale database deployments and data gathering exercises who just actually have no real database skills, no experience of administering large surveys, and they're expected to deliver results at a level that is, I think, quite unfair given their skills levels. Obviously, associated with that, we often find that when efforts are made to train those staff, there's very high staff turnover because, as we all know, governments are unfortunately not able to sustain the salaries that people with those skills would command in the private sector. So very often, as soon as people do get skilled, they get lost to the project quite quickly. And then the last two, which are spoken about a bit, but somewhat less often, is the problems of lack of data and weak evaluation and monitoring systems. I think it's the latter one that interests me particularly because, again, I've just seen so many projects where technology is rolled out before any kind of baseline is developed, for example. So when people are rolling out the technology, they actually don't have any clue whether or not the interventions that they're starting to roll out are actually having any effect at all. And by the time they come around to wanting to assess that, it's very often too late because it's impossible, obviously, retrospectively to develop a clear baseline as to what the situation was before the technology was put into the schools. So these are all things that I suspect you've read about before, that you've heard about before, and putting together this blog just led me to reflect on why it is the case that we're seeing these patterns being repeated over and over again. And it was interesting to me as I looked at the literature that I read through in preparation for this exercise, that there was very little reflection I saw in reports. People tended to describe these problems that I've just elaborated, and they said, these are things you have to worry about. But no one then went into a sort of next level of analysis to say, why is it the case that governments keep repeating these problems? And so that's what interested me primarily in putting together the short paper that I did. And I think something that we all intuitively know, but that I find very seldom written about, possibly because it's contentious, is that actually increasingly I've come to the conclusion that almost all large-scale ICT and education initiatives are actually driven by political motivations that have very little, if anything, to do with making sure that there's an improvement in educational outcomes. It may be stated that that's the objective, but in fact, if you scratch at the surface, in my opinion, the vast majority of initiatives are actually driven by the imperative of some or other politician, whether it's actually a minister or maybe even someone very senior in the bureaucracy, or potentially even outside of the Ministry of Education, maybe at a prime ministerial level, for example, or within the Ministry of ICT is another very common location, where in fact the objective is to deliver on short-term promises that have been made to the electorate to supply hardware. And there are lots of other things that go with that, but I think if you strip away the initiatives to their bare essence, really the core promise is we will deliver all these laptops or tablets to individual students or all these computers to schools, or whatever the case might be. And I think that that's based on a false assumption that you can establish a correlation between supplying the technology and delivering a 21st century education to students in a country. Unfortunately, the reality is that when an initiative is driven from that motivation, and I have to say that I don't think there's any intrinsic problem with a political motivation driving an ICT in education initiative. But I think the difficulty is that once that happens, it starts to have a distorting effect on the way in which the initiative rolls out. The first and obvious one is that because the initiative is political, the need to roll out fast is quite high. And the consequence is that there's early reliance on unsustainable sources of funding. So maybe the Prime Minister or a minister will be able to get a once-off allocation, often very large allocations of money, to procure hardware, maybe to buy some software and content, and typically always also to do some initial teacher training. But usually that funding has very limited time windows, so it's generally running in maybe a 1 to 3 year cycle. And the reality is that the way in which that funding has been allocated is unsustainable. So in other words, there hasn't been any effort to dislodge some costs in the education system, to build that into recurrent budgets of the education system and so on. So once that money is spent, then all the recurrent costs of sustaining the technology will be felt, but the money available to cover the cost of that will no longer be there. And so what tends to happen in my experience is that what looked like progress in the beginning, as the technology is rolled out, quite quickly becomes failure. And I think linked to that is this pressure to deliver on accelerated timelines. Because that funding is operating in a narrow time window, what tends to happen then, as the planning process starts off, in my experience, with great intentions and with really good planning processes, often with lots of consultation with key stakeholders and so on. But when the time to implement comes, so much time has been spent on all that planning that then the pressure to deliver increases very dramatically. And as a consequence of what happens is the project plan becomes disconnected. When that happens, my experience is that the rollout of the technology moves the fastest. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that rolling out technology is just easier than any of the other elements of an ICT in education initiative. And technology companies are a bit like Coca-Cola. They're actually very efficient at being able to get their hardware into a country and then be able to distribute that hardware through their value-added resellers or whatever the case might be quite fast into many different locations simultaneously. But of course, the rest of the system is not quite as well prepared for that. So the processes, the well-intentioned processes, for example, of providing capacity building to school principals, of making sure that there are ICT and education plans in each of the schools before the technology is supplied, and that there's been capacity building for teachers, that there's high quality content in place, etc., all start to lag behind that technology rollout. And in my experience, it's almost guaranteed that when the pace of rollout of the hardware moves ahead of all of the other elements of an ICT and education initiative, failure is almost guaranteed. I won't say it's definitely guaranteed, but I think it's, especially if we're looking at the system as a whole, I think more likely than not, we can feel confident that that investment is going to fail. Incidentally, I think that that's also why there's such a reluctance to invest in proper impact evaluation. And by impact evaluation, what I mean is an evaluation that defines a very clear educational objective and then measures the performance of the system before the technology is rolled out, and then seeks to remeasure after a certain period, let's say 1, 2, or 3 years, and assess whether or not the rollout of the technology has actually led to an improvement in that educational outcome or not. And I have great sympathy for people not wanting to do impact evaluation, because particularly when you spent a lot of money of governments on rolling out hardware in the way I've just described, there's generally no upside to doing impact evaluation, because at best, the impact evaluation can tell you that the intervention succeeded, but everyone expected it to succeed, so you don't really get any reward for that. But at worst, the impact evaluation can tell you that the investment was a complete failure. And from a political perspective, that is obviously not something that anyone wants to hear. So, for example, in Kenya, where I actually had access to around $750,000 to be able to do an extended impact evaluation of the initiative to roll out laptops to primary school children, we found it very difficult to get the necessary political go-ahead. We had great willingness on the part of the Ministry of Education to invest that money in an impact evaluation, but unfortunately the process is got completely blocked by the political process, because I think the politicians understood that there was just no benefit to be gained from finding out whether or not the initiative was successful, primarily because the commitment to spend the money had already been made. And I think that's the difficulty when you have a politically driven agenda. So linked to that is what I then described as policy complexity and the lack of integration of ICT in education policies with everything else. So when I first started this work back in about 1992, 93, I got very involved in policy development with the South African Department of Education. And as I mentioned in the blog, that led to the creation of South Africa's e-learning white paper. I think with the benefit of hindsight, if I was to be participating in a process like that again, I would refuse to create a separate e-learning white paper or separate ICT in education policy, because my experience over and over again is that when the policy on ICT in education is separate from the mainstream education policies, you tend to find that there are actually competing policy imperatives. And increasingly, I think that if ICT in education investments are to have any success, they must be integrated into a simplified policy environment. So what I tried to do in this diagram is just draw a kind of reinforcing cycle, which I think all countries on the continent have experienced to some degree or another, where as we identify a new problem that we're trying to solve, the solution has tended to be to create a new policy to respond to that problem, whether it's been the problem of dropout of students, the problem of responding to ICT in education, problems of literacy, whatever the case might be. And we then end up with multiple policy instruments that create increasingly complex policy environments. And the more I look at that, and particularly, for example, the work that I'm doing at the moment on education management information systems with the World Bank, the more convinced I am that complexity is very substantively leading to the problems that we experience, which is really that our education systems are being put under a burden to deliver too many results simultaneously. And in the case of ICT in education, that's a real problem, because it means that ICT in education becomes a policy problem in its own right. And so the rollout of technology becomes seen as another initiative which has its own set of problems, and those problems need their own solutions. But in fact, the rollout of ICT should be structured very specifically around the core agreed high-level policy imperatives of the country that existed without the ICT. And then the role of ICT should be to see how do we make sure that the investment in ICT supports the achievement of those objectives. And so I think as soon as an ICT in education policy becomes a separate document, I think you end up with a disjuncture. It creates enormous complexity, and I think that tends to weigh the initiative down. Again, people tend not to want to talk about that because there's an entire business model and market that is based on generating new policies. And that's not only amongst the IGOs like UNESCO and the Commonwealth of Learning and the World Bank, as well as lots of consultants like myself. It's also, in fact, about the governments themselves, because actually to make simpler policies is not really politically appealing. You can't launch a big new initiative that way. You can't gain any short-term political points. But unfortunately, in my experience, it's the simple basic things that tend to work the best. And so needing to get commitment to those, and then making sure that investments in ICT drive towards them, those very simple policy objectives, is critical to success. So I think what tends to happen then when you have those unrealistic policy objectives for ICT, and I've seen this just happening over and over again, is that when an ICT in Education initiative is rolled out, it's rolled out on top of a system that otherwise is fundamentally not changing in any other meaningful way at all. And if you can think in all economic sectors where ICT has had a really disruptive effect, where I think we can see, for example, clear productivity gains to be had from ICT. So if we take, for example, the banking sector, where banks have integrated the use of ICT into how their systems function in ways that have completely transformed our experience as customers. The reality is that when ICT is rolled out into the education system, none of the ways in which the education system operate change at all. And so that means that all of the underlying costs of running that education system remain the same. But in addition to that, we've now layered on top of that a whole lot of hardware, software, content, teacher training requirements, all of which need to be funded. But as I've spoken about earlier, there's actually no available new funding to fund those activities. So as a consequence, what's having to happen is that some of the money that's being used to run the system the way it ran before the ICT in Education initiative came on board has to be now diverted into the ICT in Education investment. But on the flip side, there's been no change in how that system is functioning. And if you think about that logically, the only consequence of that can be to erode the quality of operations of that system. Because either the system needs to become more expensive, but we're not getting new money in, so that's not happening. Or alternatively, we're taking the same financial and human capacity and now spreading it over a system that has more operational requirements. And in my experience, there are no circumstances under which that will lead to improved quality. So I think that where many ICT in education investments fail is that they do not carry with them an understanding of how the system's behavior will change because of that investment, and how that change in behavior will actually lead to cost savings or increased productivity somehow. And I can share with all of you, if you're interested, lots and lots of examples of initiatives that fall into those categories. For me, that links to the next problem, which is that because focusing on ICT in the classroom, particularly from a political perspective, is much more fun than looking at administration and management of the system as a whole, investments paradoxically start typically by investing in the use of technology for the student directly. In other words, we either give all the students laptops or tablets, or we put computer laboratories into the schools and we want to see them being used in the classroom, and then we have to come up with all sorts of complicated ways to manage that scarce resource. But in this, at the same time, we don't leverage that technology for all the things we already know that it's good at. For example, making sure that information that flows from schools back to the center is flowing directly into a centralized database system. I'm amazed at how many EMIS systems still have many, many steps of data capture before information gets to the central EMIS. And this is an obvious gain that can be derived, and it's an immediate cost saving that the system can incur. But equally, in the same way, the system tends to continue using the very old elaborate communication systems through, for example, provincial or district offices or whatever the case might be. Obviously, these have different names in different countries, but the structure is basically the same. Instead of us using the technology to do some of the obvious things, like making sure that when the communication is sent out from the Ministry of Education, that communication can go out immediately to everybody at the same time using technology. Or, for example, that when a textbook distribution initiative is underway, that we use technology to be able to track the distribution of textbooks down to schools and give schools the tools using SMS or whatever the case might be to be able to inquire what the status of that delivery is. Those are all uses of technology that have been well proven in terms of their productivity gains in many education and non-educational sectors. And yet, unfortunately, at the national level, when we start planning initiatives, the focus tends to be first on the areas where the impact is not proven, which is about the use of ICT in the classroom. But I think it's clear that the reason why that happens is because the investment of ICT in the classroom is a much more appealing thing to be associated with. If you're a politician, I'm not sure that you get any particular gain from being able to say that now all the schools can receive the email from the minister at the same time. But you get great benefit from being able to stand next to a computer laboratory in a school and smile and shake hands with the principal and say, this is the wonderful investment that we've made, and everyone seems happy. But the truth is that those latter investments are typically the ones that most quickly fail, whereas I think investments in systems and systemic uses of ICT tend to have greater likelihood of success. I also think very importantly that if we focus on those admin and management uses first, we can get the system used to the use of technology, and we can start to get transformation in the way in which it behaves that can actually prepare the system for much more effective use of ICT in the classroom down the line. But again, I think this is something that people struggle to talk about because there's so much emphasis on the transformative role of ICT in pedagogy. The simple truth is that for ICT to be able to transform pedagogy, school systems have to go through so much policy change, which they are simply not able to go through, that there's no way in which that transformative potential can be met in the short term. That has to be a long-term 10 or 12 or 15-year program. But of course, politically driven initiatives can't operate to those timeframes. And that then leads me to the last point, which is that what then accompanies that is that when we're driving a rollout for political reasons, it's important that we have to ensure that everybody gets the same thing, because otherwise, politically it becomes problematic. That part of your constituency complains that, well, you got that school these things and we didn't get that. What I tried to indicate in the blog is that I think that beyond some basic uses of technology, for example, for communication, data management, and other kinds of purposes, I actually think that successful investments in ICT, the ones that have been documented, tend to be the ones where, in fact, a school's receipt of investments in hardware, software, and so on are actually dependent on them demonstrating that they have gone through the necessary planning processes to be able to absorb the effect of that investment, and that they've thought it through carefully. What's been very clear from the history of evaluation of ICT in education initiatives is that although the school principal is not a sufficient condition for success, there are almost no sustained successes in ICT and education investments in which the school principal does not play a central role in ensuring that success. So I think if one was looking for a model where schools only started receiving investments when their school management committee or their principal and their heads of departments had been able to assemble a kind of school ICT and education plan that demonstrated their ability to be able to absorb that investment, you'd actually see much more effective use of the resources. But as I say, unfortunately, once the process is politically motivated and politically driven rather than educationally motivated, it's very difficult to implement that type of approach. So obviously, what I've put down here is, as far as the possibilities go, which you might like to think about and which maybe we can start to talk about now that we've got some time, is I think these, for me, are at least four key ways in which, or four key conditions that we need to meet if we want to ensure that ICT and education investments have any chance of success. The first one, as I've said, is to start with the use of ICT to improve systemic efficiency. It's the place where we know how ICT can most successfully be used. There are lots of low-hanging fruits, so to speak, that we can get immediate gains if we make the right investments. But we can also make sure that through those investments, we put the necessary infrastructure for connectivity and power and so on in place. And then once we've demonstrated that investment in ICT is actually leading to financial savings in the system, then we can start to look at the next level of use of ICT for educational purposes. And then what that would imply, as I say, is to really halt or very significantly slow the pace of policy implementation processes. I think this is, at the moment, probably my number one obsession in terms of all the advice and support that I give, is I think people are just trying to achieve too many things too fast in national education systems in African countries. We need to slow that down. We need to focus on fewer things, and we need to make sure that our policy implementation achieves a couple of key targets. I unfortunately think, which I think is also a contentious statement, that very often things like the SDGs and the MDGs that came before them, as well as various of the proclamations from UNESCO and others about human rights and the obligations of education systems to deliver, although they're all very well intentioned, I actually think they have the effect of exacerbating this problem, because they put governments under enormous pressure to deliver results in timeframes that are simply not achievable. And I think all of us who live in Africa and who work in African education systems, in my opinion, have a responsibility to fight against the tendency to put education systems under false pressure to achieve too many targets too quickly, because the history of that is that it simply doesn't work. So then, as I've also indicated, I think that if we could shift to ICT investments that were driven by an education policy motivation, that would enable us to have phased rollouts that were contingent on schools demonstrating their absorption capacity, because the driving motivation for the investment would not be the desire to give everybody a laptop or to give every school a computer laboratory. The drive would be to achieve an educational outcome, and the system and the school has to be prepared to deliver that outcome before it's worth investing in them. And that would demand that we measure impact against these defined educational objectives, because then we would really need to know whether or not the investment was having its intended effect. Not necessarily to stop the investment, but to make sure that we learned in a virtuous way from impact evaluations what was working and what wasn't working, and we were able to change our planning on a continual basis in response to what we were learning from those impact assessments. I have to say, sadly, and without wanting to close on a cynical note, that having looked back over the history of 25 years of documentation of ICT in education initiatives, I can see no strong evidence that the large-scale initiatives, at least, that are rolling out are showing much evidence of starting to learn from these lessons and actually introducing these kinds of approaches into their planning. Sometimes they claim they're going to, but then if you look at how the project rolls out, actually they become driven by the same short-term implementation imperatives as previous projects. So I live in hope, but I don't hold my breath waiting for the change to happen, unfortunately. Thank you very much. So that's the end of my presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Neil. That's wonderful presentation, and it opened up a lot of dimensions in terms of the challenges and ending with possibilities. Colleagues, one of the diagrams what Neil presented, so that was not clearly legible in the presentation. Maybe you can read through that the blog, and you can maybe look at that diagram. That one, Neil. Yeah. So yeah, maybe in the blog you can see that in detail. So maybe at this stage, so let's open the floor for questions. We have around 18 participants, and also we have Jerome, CEO of Jesse, joined us. Jerome, maybe you can also say.
Hi, Neil. We haven't spoken for a long time. It's great to hear you, and I'd like to thank you. Thank you very much for a great rundown based on a lot of experience and knowledge. And it's wonderfully refreshing to hear somebody talk about ICT integration, without the hype and using all these adjectives that the industry is kind of embedded in us, like revolution and transformation and all kinds of upheaval type phraseology that they have been around for the last 25 years. I think all the points you made were really excellent. I like the fact that you said if schools and authorities, regional and national, should look at the easy wins, if you like, bringing in technology to increase the effectiveness and efficiency of administration, like accountability, like teacher presence, like like statistical data going back to the ministry every month, etc., etc. I mean, I think that would be a great way to start. And of course, it would be guaranteed to be a success. But however, as you said, it's not a sexy application of technology. But I think number two, you'd have the unions against it. Of course, it wouldn't be supported at all by the unions, the teachers' unions, who for one obvious reason, for industrial relations reasons, but also because they would see that any innovation or any money that's pumped into schools should be related to their primary activity in the classroom. So, I mean, it's a hard one, but I do think that ministries are going to have to make a decision on this. And yeah, we hear a lot of talk and a lot of discussion about EMIS systems. I've heard it for years, like you have, but you know, there's nobody really pushing it. It isn't politically attractive. Of course, it isn't. But but I do think it's where you could start, and it would be a great way to show the potential of technology in one section of schooling as an institutional activity. That's for sure. I also think that there's the bigger picture here, which you mentioned about why aren't governments kind of more focused and awarding or voting more money for education reform through the use of technology, or indeed education reform in general. I think what's lacking here is any kind of intergovernmental support for education. Education is a little bit like a road to a small village. You know, if the road is functioning and the cars are driving on it, leave it alone. It will carry on forever. So why would you bother upsetting it, or why would you get people objecting, even parents who will object to radical use of technology in some cases, and those are, you only have to go into YouTube and you'd see senior students in London complaining that the teacher is too slow about activating the interactive whiteboard. You know, so you have all kinds of people against any kinds of creative intervention or reform of the education system. While we have the current examination system, of course, that's the deadener, isn't it? That's the deadener everywhere. And of course, it's one of the main reasons why you don't have too much evaluation either, because all you're doing is, if you say, oh, the system is working great, all our students are scoring higher, all you're doing is copper fastening the old system, you know. So it's I think reformers want to keep away from that, from that kind of unwanted side effect. But however, I really enjoyed your presentation, Neil, and it's good to hear you.
Thank you. You haven't asked any questions. I just want to respond to that last one about the curriculum reform. And for me, curriculum reform sits at the heart of the problem of overly complex policy imperatives. Because, so my children, I've got two children, one is 9 and one is 12, and they're both in a very elite private school here in Johannesburg, because unfortunately I've lost a little bit of faith in our public education system here in recent years. Even there, I'm amazed at the focus in standardized testing on areas of the curriculum that are just completely irrelevant to their long-term prospects. So I've got nothing against them learning about all these things. But if I'm interested in knowing what progress they're making, really the things I'm interested in are, can they write properly? Can they read properly with understanding? What's their information literacy skills? What's their numeracy skills like? What's their information literacy skills like? And the rest of the stuff is just detail. And yet our curriculum systems are forcing standardized testing across so many different diverse subject areas, most of which are increasingly redundant and an increasingly small portion of human knowledge. I think the simple solution is just to abandon them and say we're only going to focus in the standardized national testing on these core competences that we think are essential to the future development. Now, we will then encourage schools to do much more enriched curriculum work around that, but we don't have to control and police that from the center in the way that we currently are. And I think you're right, that if we make those kinds of bold curriculum reform choices, which again, to my earlier points, are about stripping away policy, not adding new policy, then we actually create the space for ICT and education investments to achieve their full potential. But until we do that, we mustn't be surprised that they carry on failing and that they carry on wasting money, because it's very difficult to see in my mind how they're going to succeed.
Sure.
Sorry, I sound very cynical.
Well,
But maybe others have some questions.
Yeah. Colleagues, anyone want to raise your hand?
Yeah, Senthil,
Yes, buddy.
I'd like to make an observation on what
Yes,
Neil
please.
has said, and maybe the question
Yes, buddy, go ahead.
come out of that. But that is, and Neil hinted at this, that education systems are not really changing. Other sectors and other systems are changing very fast, and they are using technology to change and also to become more efficient and effective, whereas education is very slow to do that. We all know that education systems are notorious for resisting change, whereas they should actually be leading the change leaders and the change agents, and they profess to be, but in fact, in many cases, they are not. So I agree very much with your experience, Neil, that ICT in education is rolled out on top of an unchanging and a flawed system. And it is expected to improve that system. Of course, that's a false assumption, so it will fail. There is some background noise. Can everybody?
Yes, I think, so let me ask Simon to mute his mic.
And that is also, Neil, why ICT in education and ICT integration in teaching and learning does not only become more expensive, but it is also been seen as increasing the workload of teachers. If it is integrated as you suggest, it would not do that. If it's integrated in the overall education policy and not a separate policy. If it is planned in that way and strategized in an integrated manner, it should not increase a teacher's workload. Maybe a little bit at the beginning, but over time, it should in fact reduce a teacher's workload because of the possibilities and the functionalities that ICT tools offer. So I think this is a very rich webinar, and you know, I hope that the discussion will not stop here, but that everybody participating today and all of those reading the blog will continue to think about these issues, and in planning new initiatives would try to bring these learnings into those initiatives. And I think to some extent that is what we are trying to do with our EDSI model and the digital schools of distinction. For example, the schools should be ready for absorption. And the head teachers and the management of the school and even the PTAs and the school boards, all of those should be involved in that planning and in taking those decisions and in supporting the school to become ready to move forward in this regard. So just an observation. I didn't really come to a question, but just to agree with you on your experience and on what you have raised in this regard.
I'll just amplify the one point you made right at the end there about the engagement of the community. And that's that it's interesting. I've been doing quite a lot of evaluation work of elementary education initiatives in India as part of work that I do for the World Bank. And it's fascinating that I've actually now honed to a fine art the ability to tell within about 15 seconds of walking into a school premises. I don't actually have to even get onto the premises, just walking up towards it. You can tell immediately which schools have active community school management committees that actively harness the relationship between the community and the parents, because they just look fundamentally different from the schools that don't have that vibrant relationship. The sense of self-respect and pride in the school is evident immediately where that relationship is healthy. And if I look at that, which admittedly is anecdotal data, but I think increasingly there's quite a lot of qualitative and quantitative data that supports this assessment, I think that a much greater proportion of ICT in education initiatives should be driven by the relative health of that school-community relationship. And I think there are simple metrics you can put in place to determine whether or not it's functioning and healthy. And if it isn't, I think you can know for sure that an ICT in education initiative is going to fail. And I would make it exactly as you said, Patty, kind of contingent requirement. That if you can't get those basic things in order, then we can't invest further in the school until you do, because they make such a profound difference to the functioning of the school. So I agree with that observation particularly.
Okay.
Jefferson.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
Okay, and I wanted to say most of the African schools, including Kenya, for example, are willing to implement or to integrate ICT, but the problem is resources. Most schools lack the facilities. I mean, they lack computers. Otherwise, they can provide rooms for ICT integration. So I'm wondering whether there are donors in other countries like the United Kingdom, where some of the computers are refurbished and donated to the African schools, particularly Kenya. So another thing is about the capacity building, about the teachers. There is new system which is being implemented now in Kenya, and ICT is one of the main tool for delivery of content. So my appeal is donor community to assist us, the Africans, to implement the same, if it is possible. Through Chesky and ATSI, I'm sure many schools will have to join this partnership. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry to say that we're working quite a lot in Kenya at the moment. So we're working, for example, with the KICD, for example, on the development of some of those capacity building programs with UNESCO in Kenya at the moment. And also through the World Bank, I've begun some initial engagement around what I think is a really very promising initiative to strengthen the EMIS systems that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And so I think it's clear to me that there are a lot of very positive developments taking place in Kenya. Having said that, I think that if the dependence of an ICT in education initiative is going to be on donors in Kenya, which, let's face it, is a middle income country, then I struggle to see where the sustainability for that investment will lie. So we've got quite a lot of examples, for example, of donors trying refurbished computer initiatives, for example, to take computers from the developed world and to bring them into African countries. What we've tended to see is that ends up with a lot of technology dumping. In other words, that old technology gets taken into African countries and dumped into schools and classrooms. And when you then go back after about a year or so, you find that most of that technology is dysfunctional, either because it was so old that it stops working quite soon thereafter, or alternatively because you end up with such a mix of different technologies in place that the maintenance requirement for it to be sustained is quite difficult to put in place. So those kinds of initiatives haven't demonstrated great success. I think the other problem, no matter how much, if you look at the size of the Kenyan education system and the size of the budget, unless there's some magical change to the way in which donors are allocating funds to African investments, which I haven't seen over 25 years. The reality is that whatever a donor will contribute is going to be a drop in the ocean compared to the long-term sustainability requirements of the kind of investment you're describing. And so that's why I think that as you move forward with the rollout in Kenya, it really is critical for you to be thinking about how you're going to be embedding those costs into your national education budget on a long-term basis. I think if you can start to get that clear, then I think you're in a much stronger position to be able to start a discussion with donors about how they can make some seed contributions to getting things up and running, maybe some capacity building initiatives, maybe some initial investments in your EMIS system, which is already happening through the World Bank project, maybe some some initial rollout of some technology, for example, some impact evaluation work, whatever the case might be. But I think it's really got to be critical that that is done within a context in which you're seeing the line items for regular, sustained maintenance of an ICT infrastructure for the school system embedded into the education budget in a way that is not harming the system. Now, as we were talking about earlier, in my experience, it's very difficult to achieve that unless you're prepared to engage in some kind of more radical reform. So that might include some curriculum reform to transform exactly what you're teaching. It may, for example, and this is where the issue about unions gets quite difficult. You know, a large part of the reason why we have education structures the way we do is not actually to manage them. It's to function as an elaborate post office in an environment where there's no communication technology. And so if you can get a message straight from the center to the school, you don't need to go through the district and the circuit and the other offices on the way down to pass that message along. Then what you start doing is you make people's jobs redundant. And now the difficulty is who wants to hear that their jobs become redundant because they've been replaced by technology? So in my opinion, what you have to start thinking about there, because you can't make people's jobs redundant, is to start talking about how you'll redeploy people to new functions. So maybe those people who used to be part of that communication distribution system, can we reskill them to become the people who are responsible for the maintenance of that ICT equipment? If we're getting refurbished equipment in place, maybe they can be retrained so that they can actually provide that technical support to schools, and then we can make that affordable. So I think that support from the donor community can come, but it's going to be a very small percentage of the total cost. I think if you're expecting it to be more than that, you're probably a little idealistic. But I think that if you've got good plans, then I think the relationships with the donors can be productive ones, and I think you can derive benefits. I hope I'm making sense what I'm saying there.
Yes.
Okay, colleagues, anyone else with the questions? If not, Mary want to ask. Mary?
Well, okay. I don't know. Thank you very much, Neil, for a wonderful webinar. I think it leaves more questions than answers, but also provokes us to think about these questions. I liked it. I like the blog. I think there's many opportunities for us colleagues to go into the blog and add to the discussion. And I also like the way it is provocative. You are kind of pushing us based on your experience and research and work with World Bank, with UNESCO, all over this continent and other continents, because we have followed your work. Indeed, and it has provided us with very good practical frameworks that have informed our work as well. So thank you very much for that. I'm not sure if I have questions. I think that some of the issues that you have raised, for example, in stripping down policy and also in quick wins and so on, I think that these are questions for debate. Particularly if you think about, you know, the whole issue about bringing a technology tool into the school and the whole aspect about absorption capacity of the school and so on. My question would be, to absorb technology, how? Is it to absorb technology to make the status quo more efficient, which of course it can do? As you said, MS systems as well, in terms of knowledge flows from the center to the base and the base back to the center. But again, it comes to deeper questions. Knowledge flows for what? As the unions would say, is it to actually, you know, even in terms of the shift in education towards performance targets and so on, it can make the whole system very, very efficient. But performance for what? To, again, maintain the status quo, make it more efficient, highly performing teachers who churn out youngsters who do very well in this examination system and so on. And again, even if you bring a tool like technology into school systems, it will actually create tension. And the interesting thing about the tension or the disruption is it going to, in which way actually will that disruption go? And are we giving space for that kind of disruption? Because as you said, Neil, even if you strip it down and say, let's keep it simple, let's keep it focused on what we want, even a very small change, like taking a technology tool into an ADSI program like we're bringing it into ADSI, and creating space for teachers to look at that tool and how they can implement it into STEM teaching, and meeting in teacher groups to reflect on practice and to look at what they're doing, that has huge implications for policy. It has immediate implications at school level in the way schools organize their timetables. It creates tensions immediately in relation to what are the priorities. Is this going to do harm to schools in terms of classes and in terms of organization of classes? When will teachers meet? Will they meet during timetable times or during their lunch times? Will this tire teachers out? And so on. And again, it keeps bringing you back to tensions that, as Patty mentioned, and indeed Jerome, in education systems. No matter which way you look at it, it will actually perhaps strip down policy to the lowest common denominator at the beginning. Let's see, if you can organize a school plan around technology, but the other questions will follow. A school plan for what? What is the vision? And what actually are the affordances within the school for opportunities for change, even limited change, given that the systems, as you said, are very complex and they won't change maybe for 10 to 15 years. But you can still see teachers being very innovative and very creative, even within limited affordances of systems. I don't know whether I have asked a question or whether I have just gone on. But put it this way, Neil, you have got me thinking, and I'm not sure if you have a response to all of that.
Well, I won't have a response to all of it. But I think the key point, again, which in fact, I don't think the questions flow from ICT for what. I think the question starts with what. In other words, what is our policy objective? And that policy objective has to be educational. And if we just, so if we take away the ICT piece completely, my opinion is that all education systems are overburdened with a proliferation of policy instruments and policy objectives that actually prevent them from functioning effectively. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that has to do with the reality that centralized bureaucracies tend to generate policies to sustain themselves, not to make the system more efficient. And so centralized bureaucracies generate more policies because those policies create a greater demand for centralized bureaucracy, not because they create better education systems. That's a very cynical view, but having been at it for 25 years and I heard you, Mary, talking about change happening in 10 to 15 years. Well, that's what I thought when I started working in this sector. I have to say, having been here for 25 years, I think if we got change in 10 to 15 years, that would be a miracle. Because short of experiencing significant social crisis, I don't know what will drive a policy reform initiative of the kind that I'm describing, but I think it's what we need to work towards. And until that is clearly defined, what that simplified policy objective or set of objectives is going to be, I think it's very difficult to make ICT and education investments at a macro level work successfully. That doesn't remove at all what you said about at the margins in the individual schools, those competent, dedicated teachers from using technology very, very effectively. There's lots of that happens. But I think we must be clear, when we're talking about a national ICT and education initiative, we're talking about macro level interventions. And in my experience, macro level interventions cannot recreate what happens successfully at the micro level. All they can successfully do is create the conditions in which innovation and success can thrive at the micro level. Unfortunately, the vast majority of them try to recreate a micro level success. In other words, they try and replicate that excellent teacher's experience across every classroom in the country. That can never work. The only thing they can ever do successfully is create the conditions for that type of innovation and success to happen at the micro level. But unfortunately, that's not how policies are constructed. I have another much more disparaging view, which is that part of the problem is that too many academics participate in the development of policies, and very few of them have ever had any practical experience of running large-scale systems. So they design policies that replicate the micro-level environments that they're familiar with. And unfortunately, those don't work successfully. So I do believe, which I think is consistent with what you're saying, that it has to start with policy simplification. And if we don't start there, the rest of the things are not going to succeed. I see there's a question from Simon as well. So I don't know, we're past the time, but I'm happy to carry on if everyone...
Maybe one last question, Neil. Simon is waiting for queries. Simon, can you go ahead and ask your question? Simon?
Yes. Hello.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes. Yes.
Yes. Okay. My question is, on how can we help school administrations? How can we help school administration in easily adoption of ICT at both management level and curriculum implementation?
So if we're talking about the school administration at the level of an individual school, if I'm understanding your question correctly, I think the reality is that it's very difficult to persuade school administrations to adopt ICT for either school management or curriculum delivery purposes, unless that is built into the way in which their performance is measured and the way in which funding is allocated to the school. So the problem is that ICT and education initiatives tend to run parallel to the mainstream schooling system. And as a result, we supply lots and lots of things to the school, lots of technology, lots of hardware, lots of connectivity, lots of teacher training. But actually, there's no imperative for the school to change its behavior in any way, shape, or form before we supply all those things. I think under those circumstances, to expect any change to happen is quite unrealistic. So again, I'd go back to what I said earlier, which is that I would start to treat an investment in ICT as a reward for a school having achieved some specific policy objectives. In other words, if you can demonstrate that you have a well-functioning relationship with your community as a school principal, then we will reward you by making sure that we supply you access to some of these investments and help you to deliver better results in terms of how you run your school and so on. What would happen very quickly then, and I've seen some examples of this happening on a smaller scale, is that if one school is deriving benefit from functioning effectively and another school is not, the grapevine is a very effective way of communities then starting to put pressure on other schools that is, well, how come that school is getting all these things and this school is not? And then starting to engage and starting to create a virtuous cycle of change. The problem though is that when the technology investment is just being pushed downwards, there's really no incentive for anyone to change their behavior at all. Unfortunately, I don't have great optimism that those kinds of approaches, which would have to be driven by a different policy imperative, are going to work successfully, because the reality is, and I have great sympathy for the people who are in these positions, that when you're the head of a centralized bureaucracy or public bureaucracy, it's very difficult to treat people differently because you come under enormous political pressure for doing that. So if we agree that schools will only receive investments once they start achieving performance targets, then some politician comes back and says, well, how come all the schools in my district are not getting this benefit and other schools are? And then they start pressurizing you to deliver all those benefits to the schools, even though they haven't actually performed in the way that justifies that. So I think that those are parts of the problems. I see Gabriel has made a comment here that schools do relatively well with using computers and ICTs for administration purposes rather than for teaching and learning. And I agree completely with what you're saying, Gabriel. That's why I said, I think in my last slide, that I think that one of the strategies that ICT and education initiatives should adopt is to make sure that a technology platform is first rolled out for those administrative and communications and management purposes, and that it should be working successfully, because that's how people will get used to using the technology. And only when that's working successfully should we consider the second wave of investment in teaching and learning. Again, unfortunately, my experience is that the vast majority of national initiatives start the other way around. They start with the investment for teaching and learning and not with the investment for administration. But I completely agree with what you've said there, Gabriel.
Neil, is it possible to accommodate one final question from Francis?
Yeah, I've got plenty of time, so as long as we don't
Francis, go ahead.
Technology, that's fine.
Yes, Francis, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I've been having problems with connections. I can't exactly say where you are. Maybe I'll comment in a short while. I don't know whether my line is very good.
It's
now
good
you're
now.
okay. Yeah, you're good. Yeah, go ahead.
So basically, I wanted to hear what really the participants are saying about really the problems we usually make each time, or the mistakes that are done, especially in the Kenyan perspective, really, where we want to digitize education, and it's like we need experience. We need to find out exactly what's happening or what has failed, and we should not land into the same problems. So thank you.
That's a great pleasure. And I'm taking it from what you said earlier, Francis, that because of your connectivity problems, you weren't able to listen to my initial presentation, or were you able to hear the initial presentation as well?
I did not get, I've just actually joined in. My line has been having problems. That's why I've just joined in right now.
So luckily, I think the Jesse team has been recording the presentation. So hopefully you'll be able to download that. And maybe if you listen to the first 20 minutes of the presentation, you'll hear I gave, hopefully, in my presentation really focused very much on trying to answer that question that you've just posed. So short of redoing the presentation, I think the best will be for you to listen to that again. What I'm also very happy to do, though, and I'll liaise with the colleagues at Jesse, is I've got access to quite a lot of other documents and resources which can be circulated through your network. And so if there's quite a lot of documented information on what's a requirement for success, what kinds of things have failed, etc., etc. In fact, when Tarek asked me to prepare the blog post for this session, I struggled to keep it down. I was asked to keep it to 1,500 words. But in fact, there's such a long list of things that I could answer to your question that in fact, I've got hundreds of papers on that stuff. So I could start sharing some of the more interesting ones with you. And I think they would hopefully help to guide you in Kenya. Also, by the way, as a side point, which you probably missed as well, we're doing some work in Kenya with UNESCO on developing capacity building programs for teachers in support of the work that's happening there. And I will also be coming to Kenya at some point in the near future to begin engagement around the rollout of your EMIS systems as part of work that I'm doing with the World Bank. I'm also expecting, by the way, to be in Nairobi at the end of September for the Nairobi Book Fair, because I'm doing some work on open licensing in the early literacy space. And so somewhere amongst all of that, if you make contact with me through Jesse, they'll be able to give you my contact details. Maybe we could get together and have a longer conversation about what's happening in Kenya, and I could provide you some more input.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Okay, colleagues, we have recording this session, and we'll make it available. Those who have missed out partially, or you would like to share it with your colleagues, you're most welcome to do that. Maybe it's Paddy, any final question, remarks from your side?
Nothing from me, Senthil, thank you.
Okay. Okay, so Neil, it's been a wonderful presentation and great time, and a fantastic interactive session with our participants. And So colleagues, please look at the blog and you continue to post your reflections, and we will probably request Neil to look at it, those queries, and respond maybe in a couple of weeks' time. So Neil, thank you very much for your time and the exciting webinar session. Colleagues, thank you for your participation, and so we look forward to connect with another session. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
so much. Cheerio. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.